I was pretty Catholic when I was young. I got baptized, had my first communion, went to Sunday school. I wasn't like crazy religious. I was middle class religious. I was like Simpsons religious. And like most kids, you don't really think too deeply about this. You just accept religion as a fact of life. At my elementary school, we even said grace before lunch hour because it was just assumed that every kid at the school was a Christian. And I still remember the prayer we said. Dear God, help me do the things I should to be to others kind and good, throw my work and all my play to grow more loving every day. Luckily for me, or unluckily as we get into this video, I started heavily using the internet in the late 2000s, where everything I knew about the world was questioned. All my religious beliefs were upended, as I found creators like the Amazing Atheist and websites like Reddit to tell me I was a blind sheep, nothing I believed in made sense, and it was incongruent with a mean and wicked world that didn't give a fuck about my fate. I was asked how I could pray to a God that I assumed to be all-loving and forgiving when there is starving children in Africa, when the world is plagued by starvation, famine, and death. Why would God care about me? It's 2010, I'm 12, and shit's not adding up. And I remember so vividly the day everything changed for me. We had a family dog. It was a black lab German shepherd mix named Tia, and it was 15 years old. And I knew, everyone knew, that any day that dog was gonna die. And I prayed harder than I ever could for God to, I don't know, let the dog live forever. I don't know what I wanted, I was 12. But lo and behold, later on that week, we put the dog down. And from that moment on, I knew I was an atheist. Being an atheist is the most rebellious thing a 12-year-old white kid can do in rural Canada. It was the biggest fuck you to everything you ever knew. I would argue with my parents on why we shouldn't go to church and why going to church was stupid. I smugly explained to them that Genesis wasn't a real story because if Adam and Eve, then why dinosaurs? And you know what? They folded immediately. I don't blame them for this in any capacity, but it turns out my parents did not have strong religious convictions. They also were just doing what they did since their parents raised them and not asking any questions. So that was that. I made my family agnostic, and I was a child atheist arguing with my parents at Thanksgiving dinner. Everybody was miserable. And for the rest of my childhood and early adulthood, I was a depressed, contrarian shitlord. But I thought I was a fucking genius. And like all phases you go through as a young man, I eventually forgot about my atheism and my obsession with owning Christians. I didn't start being religious again, but atheism stopped being part of my personality. And this was all during a time when most of the Western world was becoming agnostic. Since the early 2000s, the amount of religiously unaffiliated people in the West has doubled. It stopped being cool to be atheist. It stopped being contrarian to be atheist. Being agnostic was now just a fact of life as a young man in the West. But I never stopped to think about what I had lost. I had just moved on and never thought about it again. That was until the worst mass shooting in Canadian history happened in my hometown. In 2021, a man who I will not name made a fake RCMP car and dressed up as a police officer. He then continued for a whole 12-hour killing spree to burn down an entire neighborhood in Portapique, Nova Scotia, before making his way through the whole area I grew up in, killing 22 people along the way, before being shot by police officers in a gas station outside of Halifax. I remember so vividly waking up that morning to all the texts from my friends telling me that their neighbors had just been shot. My dad, who ran a grocery store in town at the time, telling me of all the customers he knew that had gotten shot and killed. And this was all during the height of the COVID pandemic. So that weekend, I made my way back to my hometown to spend some time with the town and with my friends. And as I was out for a walk, I walked past my old high school, which was completely shut down and condemned from the pandemic. No students were there. And the whole front entrance was filled with memorials and flowers of students who had gotten shot in the mass shooting. As I stopped and spent some time outside my condemned high school and looked at the memorials of kids who had just been killed in a terrorist attack, I thought to myself, holy fuck, we need God. We needed hope that the world wasn't a horrible place. We needed something to align ourselves with when we couldn't make sense of the world. And this is all during a time where I hadn't thought about God in a decade. I was heading nowhere. I had no direction in life. And furthermore, I felt the absence of God in my community. As me and my friends quietly drank some beers at a girlfriend's apartment that evening, there was unspoken confusion between all of us. A lack of direction and belief that there was good left in the world. When I left my hometown and went back to my apartment, I didn't know what I believed in, but I knew I was no longer an atheist. I didn't see God that day, but I recognized his absence. And this process of me finding my religion again would be a long one. I didn't immediately pick up a Bible and start going to church, but I recognized God's presence around me. I felt like my moral compass now had a true north, and that my life was aimed somewhere. And at this point in my life, I was a lazy bastard. I think I was like 22. I couldn't take care of myself, I couldn't do the dishes, I couldn't make my bed, I was barely passing school, and all I would do is go to my day job and waste any other free hour I had. But this malaise in my life all of a sudden felt wrong. There was a huge shift. The video games, the lack of hard work, the lack of direction all seemed painfully obvious to me now. Like I couldn't ignore it. I had this immense guilt that I was basically a leech on society. And I remember the changes I made when I got back to my apartment. I sold my PS4 and my television for super cheap online so I could get rid of them as fast as possible. I started doing the dishes, I started making my bed. I made this very specific effort to only ever wear matching socks. I know that doesn't sound like a big change, but when you're coming from nothing, only wearing matching socks and refusing to do anything otherwise is a huge step up. And to this day, for 4 years straight, I've only worn matching socks. My last semester of university went great, I got the highest marks I ever had, and I even wrote a speech to read to my graduating class. I know that sounds cringy, but what's cringe if not bleeding vulnerability? I decided that I would aim to become the best version of myself, no matter what got in the way. No matter how many bad days I had, no matter how hard I struggled with substance abuse or sleeping around, I would always do better. There's a new force inside me that always drove me to course correct, that I didn't see until I recognized its absence. People need a moral arbiter that's outside of themselves. A strong sense of right and wrong that isn't concerned with their individual desires, but rather the harmony of the universe as a whole. Left to our own devices, we will always be selfish, we will always make mistakes, and we won't be there for those around us. This journey is long, and I've only recently started going to church and actually studying the Bible. But I'm 10 times the man I was 4 years ago, and I'll be 10 times the man 4 years from now. This is what God asks of you, and this is what God is. The highest possible good that you can continually align yourself with again and again. The changes are subtle, but they'll compound. You'll find yourself a better listener. You'll find yourself being more cordial with cashiers. You'll find yourself stopping to help people on the street, not because it makes you feel good, but because this is what the world is asking of you. Asking you to help rebuild the social harmony we lost when we turned our back on religion out of ignorance. God isn't something you can explain. It's a presence you feel, and it's a presence you can't ignore once you feel it. I'm not saying I'm a good person. There's been times very recently where I've been a bad person. I'm not saying my religion absolves me of my sins, and I'm not saying religion makes you a better person than those around you. I fear that young people will find God as just another productivity tool in disguise. They find God not for its own sake, but for some imagined world where it makes you a better person than everybody else. But this isn't the case. God is a moral North Star, and hopefully you can help others recognize that God is a moral North Star for them. You act in accordance with Him because it's the best thing you can do for those around you and the world at large. To never be a bystander, to never be selfish or lazy, to step in and do what's right as often as you can. I'm not telling you to drop everything and become an evangelical Christian. I'm telling you that if you look hard enough, you'll notice the absence of God in your life. And once you notice that absence, it's impossible to ignore.